We've all heard about D-Day. We've seen the movies, read the books, memorized the American names. But what about the soldiers who fought without fanfare? What about the country that stormed the beaches, bled through the cities, and guarded the seas, and was almost entirely left out of the story? That country was Canada. In World War II, over 1.1 million Canadians served in Europe, Africa, the skies, and across the Atlantic. They weren't just background allies. They were at the front, at the worst of it, often outnumbered and always overlooked. Today, we're telling three of the most heroic Canadian stories from World War II. Stories of brutal beach landings, of urban street warfare, of naval ghost missions that saved Britain itself. These are the legends they never taught you in school, and by the time we're done, you'll never look at Canada the same way again. Hit like, subscribe to Mystery Junky, and comment below, how many of these stories did you know? June 6, 1944, D-Day. As American and British troops landed on their respective shores, Canada's mission was Juno Beach, and it was a nightmare waiting to happen. The beach was heavily fortified. German bunkers, mines, machine gun nests, and artillery waited for them. The water was rough, and the first wave of soldiers barely stood a chance. And yet, they kept going. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles, the Regina Rifles, and the North Shore New Brunswick Regiment led the charge. Many were teenagers, farmers, students, now crawling through surf under relentless fire. Boats were destroyed before even touching sand. Bullets ripped through the air as soldiers fought waist-deep in water. But they didn't stop. By noon, the Canadians had pushed further inland than any other Allied force on D-Day. They seized beachheads, villages, and roadways under constant attack. In some sectors, they suffered 50% casualties in the first hour, yet they never retreated. Their assault on Juno Beach helped break the Atlantic Wall and allowed Allied troops to move deeper into France. But for decades, Juno was overshadowed by Omaha and Utah. While American names were immortalized in movies, Canadian bravery was buried in silence. But the truth is this: without Juno Beach, the invasion may have failed, and Canada stood in the jaws of hell and kept walking forward. Winter 1943, Italy. Canadian troops of the 1st Infantry Division were ordered to take the town of Ortona, a strategic point on the Adriatic coast. What they didn't know was that the Germans had turned it into a death trap. Narrow streets, booby-trapped buildings, snipers in every window. Ortona wasn't just a battle. It was a maze of ambushes and destruction. The Canadians fought room by room, using a brutal technique called mouse-holing, blasting holes through walls to move building to building without entering streets. The fighting was so close, soldiers could hear the enemy breathing on the other side. The loyal Edmonton Regiment and the Seaforth Highlanders became legends during this hellish campaign. They were freezing, exhausted, and constantly under threat of mines and traps. And yet, they refused to give up. In just 8 days, over 2,300 Canadian soldiers were wounded or killed. But they captured Ortona, a town the Germans thought was impossible to hold. The press later called it Canada's Stalingrad. But unlike the Soviet city, there were no monuments built for Ortona. No Hollywood recreations, no best-selling books. Just ghosts and veterans who quietly carried the weight of what they saw. This was one of Canada's fiercest battles, and it was won through pure grit, in the bloodied shadows of a forgotten city. Long before D-Day, Canada was already fighting a different kind of war on the open sea, and it was just as deadly. From 1939 to 1945, the Atlantic Ocean became a battlefield. German U-boats hunted Allied supply convoys, trying to starve Britain into surrender. And, standing between them, were Canadian ships. The Royal Canadian Navy, which had started the war with just 13 vessels, grew to over 400 ships by 1945. Their job was to escort convoys from North America to Europe, across cold, dark waters where torpedoes waited beneath the waves. It was slow, terrifying, and essential. U-boats operated in wolf packs, and entire convoys could vanish in a single night. But Canadian sailors kept going. Some missions used decoy signals, silent radio zones, and radar jamming. The convoys became known as ghost fleets, moving silently, vanishing from sight, only to reappear weeks later at British ports. Their survival meant food, fuel, weapons, and troops made it to the war front. Without them, the Allies would have choked. But they paid the price. Over 2,000 Canadian sailors were killed in the Battle of the Atlantic. Dozens of ships were sunk, yet their role was barely mentioned in war reports. Because they weren't seen, only missed when they didn't arrive. But without Canada's ghost convoys, the war would have been lost before it was ever truly fought. So now we ask the hard question. Why was Canada's legacy erased? Was it because they weren't loud enough? Because they didn't have a Hollywood machine behind them? Because they didn't conquer headlines, only battles? Canada's contribution to World War II wasn't minor. It was monumental. They stormed Juno, conquered Ortona, commanded the Atlantic. They bled on beaches, froze in bunkers, drowned in stormy seas. And all they got was a footnote. But now we remember, not because we owe them pity, but because they earned our respect. Canada didn't enter World War II as a superpower. They entered as underdogs and left it as warriors. So next time someone talks about D-Day, ask them if they know Juno. Next time someone mentions Stalingrad, tell them about Ortona. And when someone praises the Battle of the Atlantic, make sure they know about the ghost convoys. Because true heroism doesn't demand attention, but it damn well deserves recognition. So much of history is shaped by the voices who tell it. And for far too long, the voices that told the story of World War II left out something essential. They left out Canada, not because Canadians didn't fight, not because they didn't bleed or die or sacrifice like the others, but because their victories weren't loud, their soldiers didn't demand the spotlight, and their country wasn't chasing glory. But should humility ever be a reason to forget, Canada didn't just help in World War II. They reshaped critical turning points. They stormed the same beaches, fought through the same Hell's Capes, and crossed the same oceans as any so-called great power. They led the charge on Juno Beach, where some of the most devastating casualties happened in the opening hours of D-Day. They braved sniper fire, landmines, and machine guns, and still pushed further inland than any other Allied force that day. They conquered the shattered streets of Ortona, a town turned into a death maze, where every wall hid danger. Every room was booby-trapped, and every step forward was paid for with blood and bone. They sailed the deadly Atlantic in silent ghost convoys, shielding the lifeline of the Allied war machine from swarms of Nazi U-boats. Without fanfare, without celebration, only duty and determination. What kind of nation does that? What kind of people give everything, knowing they may be remembered by no one? The answer is clear. The kind that knows the difference between fame and legacy. Canada's soldiers didn't just fight for their country. They fought for humanity, for a world free of tyranny, of oppression, of genocide. And what they left behind wasn't just victory. It was a standard, a blueprint for what courage looks like when it's quiet, what honor means when no one's watching. So why have they been forgotten? Why doesn't Hollywood show us Juno Beach? Why don't school books mention Ortona next to Normandy or Berlin? Why do we know more about the weapons than the men who carried them? Maybe because Canada never made noise about its role. Maybe because they were the supporting cast in someone else's narrative. But here's the thing. The truth doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. And heroism doesn't need a spotlight to exist. Canadian soldiers were not just brave. They were exceptional. They took impossible objectives, faced hopeless odds, and carried themselves with discipline, strength, and sacrifice. Ask yourself, would you charge into machine gun fire to take a beach no one would remember you for? Would you crawl through a mine street, knowing history might forget your name? Would you set sail on a convoy into a sea known as the graveyard of the Atlantic, just to deliver crates of food for someone else's army? That's what they did, and that's why we remember now. It's not about waving flags. It's about restoring truth. It's about giving back what history took away. Because without Canada, D-Day might have stalled, Italy might have held, and Britain might have starved. That's not speculation. That's not opinion. That's fact. So let this be more than a video. Let it be a wake-up call to history teachers, to filmmakers, to anyone who ever cared about telling the truth. Canada's war story matters. because it proves that greatness doesn't need permission. That heroism doesn't come from recognition. It comes from resolve. These weren't just battles. These were moments where humanity itself was measured, and Canada measured up. So when you walk past a Canadian War Memorial, or see a red maple leaf stitched into a soldier's uniform, remember this. You're looking at a symbol of warriors who gave everything and asked for nothing in return, but they deserve to be known. They deserve to be honored. And from this point on, they will be, because we don't just owe them our thanks. We owe them their place in history.